particular panel is made up of very, very special individuals because they are going to talk about visual impairment, hearing impairment, and the difference between those two and that of blindness and deafness. So allow me to introduce the panel for sensorial disabilities, Mr. Duncan, Miss Lidia, Miss Faith, Miss Sophia, and of course, our very own Mr. Jeremy. Welcome back. So Duncan, if you could kindly switch on your video and unmute, and the floor is yours, my dear friend.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Today marks a very important session. We are drawing the curtains for day one, and I'm so much delighted to moderate this conversation on how early intervention transforms learning outcomes for children with sensory disabilities. Well, our theme focuses mainly on bridging silence and the shadows. Listening from other speakers, the shadows here reminds that children who cannot see or hear like their peers often grow up unheard or unseen. Well, so we'll have very deep conversation, but before I do that, I have a mix of panelists that I will briefly give them a minute or so just to briefly introduce us and before we do our roundtable discussion. So the order of our panelists, I will begin with Faith. I'll allow Faith to briefly take us through, then Sophia, and then I'll loop in Mr. Jeremy, and then we'll finalize with Lidia. Faith, in the next 1 minute, kindly.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. This is really an amazing opportunity. My name is Faith Nyaboke. I work with Sense International, which is an organization that works with children and youth with complex disability and deaf blindness, or what we call multisensory impairment. I have around 9 years of experience in working with disability inclusion, which includes working with the Kenya Institute of Special Education, working with children in functional assessments to get to identify the type of sensory disabilities that they have. I work within the Department of Neurodiverse types of disabilities and behavioral difficulties. I've also worked as as a learning support assistant, it's a cadre that works to support children with disability, and we'll get to talk about more of it as we delve into the theme of today that I'm really passionate about. Thank you so much, Duncan.
Thank you. A lot to hear from Faith later on. Sophia.
So my name is Sophia Makuva, or Lion Sophia Makuva. I work for Lions International, specifically the Lion Site First Eye Hospital as the Director of Nursing Services. I'm also the current president for the club at the hospital. And our hospital is basically specialty hospital for sight, and it runs all the way from pediatric to geriatric. And that's the reason we focus so much on preventive treatment or primary prevention, because most blindness are preventable if addressed early. So I'm happy to join this panel to discuss about sensory disability.
Thank you, Sophia. I will also invite Mr. Jeremy Opperman to actually share with us briefly before we give him more floor later.
Thank you, Duncan, and it's good to be on the other side of the table instead of being a master of ceremonies, so it's good to be on the panel. And so my name is Jeremy Opperman. I come from South Africa, and I live in Cape Town. I am blind, and in my previous life, in my earlier life, I was low vision, which is a very typical way of becoming blind, as opposed to, as I said earlier in the day, one mustn't think of blindness in binaries. The vast majority of people with visual disabilities have low vision or residual vision and are not in fact totally blind. That's quite rare. So I am a consultant. I specialize in disability inclusion. At every sort of organizational level, I work with government, I work with private entities, I work with individuals, with the purpose to increase the level of disability inclusion in mainstream society. I have a motto: the unhesitant and natural inclusion of people with disabilities into mainstream society. That's essentially what I do.
Thank you, Mr. Jeremy. I think we'll be looking forward to hearing more about visual impairment all through to how you're managing and how responsive systems are. To wind up, Lidia Best.
My name is Lidia Best, as introduced, and I am someone who wears cochlear implant for past 15 years. I've lost part of my hearing since I was 12, and I am the president of the European Federation of Hard of Hearing People. And in the United Kingdom, where I reside, I am also a chair of National Association of Deafened People, because that's who I am. I am deafened as a person who was born hearing. And I'm also a co-chair of Make Listening Safe, which is the initiative of the World Health Organization, which is basically similar to what Sophia has mentioned of the prevention. A lot of deafness can be prevented if the children and young people know about safe listening levels of listening to their favorite music. So, so this is my introductions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lidia. Well, I think from the panelists, we can all agree that there is one similarity when it comes to intervention. I'd like to call upon Faith just to give us more spotlight. How does the early intervention process in practice actually work?
Okay, thank you, Duncan. There is the practice part, and then there is the theory part when it comes to looking at early intervention. But as we go on with the conversation, I just want us to imagine that the most common senses that we use is our hearing and our vision. And one of the most when it comes to the disability or acquisition of disability or losing one part of the senses, it's one of the most common one that preventative services or rehabilitative services are either not easy to find or are quite expensive for a typical individual growing up in either the low and middle income countries. So looking at what Sense International is doing when it comes to early intervention, we're looking at multidisciplinary way of approaching early intervention, whereby we are working in two angle of it from the health sector, that is working with public hospitals within the country in Kenya. And currently, in as much as countries are big county, 47 counties, we are able to work in 2 counties. And the reason we're working in these 2 counties, these are low income counties. And because the services were not there totally, that is Garissa and Kwale County. So what we're doing is we are having a 2-step way of looking at screening itself, where we are screening children below the ages of 0 to 4, below the ages of 5, for hearing loss and visual loss. And through community-based way of screening, that is working with community health promoters to create awareness within the communities about the screening processes. Remember, the community health promoters are coming within the households of the community. These are trusted members of the community. So by training them, by giving them this information, they're able to cascade it down to the community itself so that they're able to seek these services. And secondly, be aware of the having screening as early as possible, because we do believe that earlier screening equals early intervention, and therefore we are almost, in most cases, mitigating the effects, the adverse ability itself to an individual, and also making sure that the life that this child is gonna live is almost to a near normal, quote unquote. So what we're doing is, by practice now, working of health and Kenya, for the better part, early intervention was being done, or early identification was being done in school levels. That is through the educational assessment and resource officers, who are majorly part and parcel when it comes to the screening aspect of it. Again, when we go back to the earlier speakers in the morning, we talked about the medical model of how we were looking at disability before. So what we're trying to do is, by training the healthcare professionals to look at disability as not just medical aspect that needs treatment, by looking at it as a social aspect of it. How are we interacting with persons with disability? How are we really conveying this information to the caregivers? What is the support system that we are having within the whole system? So in the screening itself, this community aspect is also there. Then secondly, now we go into the equipment screening that is happening in the hospitals. This is where now the healthcare professionals, that is the nurses, clinicians, audiologists, the ENT teams, are trained on early screening. Remember, again, most of the times you'd find that we wait until the quote unquote the issue has happened, the health challenge or difficulty has been noted. That is when we are seeing. On the preventative aspect of it, we are screening any child. As long as you've been born between the ages of 0 to 4 years, we're screening you, just so that if we identify the difficulties, either we refer you to a partner that is able to handle the difficulty that the person has. Like in Kwale, when for children who will identify have visual difficulties, are referred to the Kwale Eye Center. But for the children who have hearing impairment, we've been able to set up the first audiological service setting in a public hospital in the country, in Kwale. So there is an audiologist within there, within the county. So the child is, sorry?
It's okay. Maybe before you introduce us to the referral pathways, allow me to loop in Sophia. There's a component about working very closely with health professionals within their 1,000 golden days. Is that a space that you're also active? I know you in the health professional.
First at Lionside First Eye Hospital, I think now we do continuation of what Faith and her colleagues are doing, because our primary prevention screening is now based in schools. So in schools, that is where now, as a hospital, we engage the teachers. We have a school screening program called Sight for Kids, which basically we go to primary schools. Primary schools, and we engage the teachers in teacher training on how to identify common eye problems like refractive errors, like most of the blindness, 80% is preventable. So we train the teachers how to be able to identify those issues, because sometimes they may be picked out as indiscipline, naughtiness, when performance is going down. And sometimes these kids may not be able to speak. So during that process, during that period, they may be being punished instead of being assessed for what actually they are suffering from. So ours is a continuation of what Faith is doing. And apart from just training the teachers, we also involve the community health promoters. We have a program that trains community health promoters, so that also the parents are able to identify these eye issues early enough for proper intervention. Because some issues are as simple as an allergy which the child keeps rubbing the eye, and this could cost the cornea. You find them now having keratoconus, having to live with contact lens, having to have corneal grafts, and it was something simple that just needed education and implementation to that effect.
So Sophia, would you say that most eye health issues among children are preventable with the right awareness and maybe school-based screenings?
Yes, indeed, that is correct. And we
Mr.
have to
Jeremy.
remember.
Yes, Sophia, finish before I loop in Mr. Jeremy.
We have to remember that 80% of classroom learning is visual. That is why our concentration is there.
Well, WHO states that out of 285 million visually impaired people worldwide, 246 million have low vision and 39 million are blind. Jeremy, you come from a country within the global south, South Africa, which from other African countries we consider being a progressive country. Do you think the system in South Africa handled your case? Was it handled properly with what Nyaboke has mentioned, that there was early screening and having more or less home-based care screening could actually support in reducing the progressiveness from visual blindness to complete blindness?
No, I think we have a problem in South Africa. You know, we are a very young country. As much as we are often looked at as the powerhouse of Africa, it's not actually particularly true necessarily. It might be in some circumstances of industry and commerce. But the fact is that we are a young country because we're a very young democracy. We're literally only 31 years old. Now, the previous regime paid very little attention to the majority of the population. So the net result is if you've got a world-class health standard for far too few people and a very substandard primary health care for the rest of the people. We're a large rural country. We were not large in Africa by African standards, but we are a large enough country. We're still very rural. And the result is that there is still a problem with access to primary health care. You said something interesting just now about preventable blindness. I heard about 20 years ago, I remember Sight Savers making a statement that South Africa had a higher preventable blindness rate than India, which is staggering. And so the culprits are things like cataracts, late onset cataracts, which are easily operated on and fixed. But because you have and poor access to primary health care, those people with cataracts, for instance, don't in fact very often receive the care that they need. Glaucoma is an incredibly strong blinder, and then diabetic retinopathy, you know, from diabetes. We're one of the highest diabetic countries in the world. So those things all combined, unfortunately, with the substandard primary health care that we have, due largely to our previous regime, but also due to the mismanagement of the current regime. And so we could do far more. When it comes to early assessment, certainly if you're in a sophisticated urban area like Cape Town or Johannesburg or Durban or Bloemfontein or maybe Port Elizabeth, you might be able to access early assessment opportunity and facilities. But by no means is that something that we can rest on our laurels about. We have a very serious attitude towards disability, unfortunately, in this country. We are playing catch up far too often. Yeah, I know I'm sounding quite negative, and there are obviously positive angles to it, but we are, unfortunately, we are in trouble in many aspects, particularly around disability, sensory disabilities, particularly. From a schooling point of view, we have 22 blind schools, over 1 million blind people, and 22 blind schools, or schools for the blind, rather. Now, not one of those
Jeremy,
schools. Yes. Sorry,
Jeremy,
Duncan, I'm going on to a new subject. I beg your pardon.
maybe allow us to pick Lidia. Lidia also has a substantial amount of hearing, and she mentioned she enjoyed mainstream learning. I think it would be good time to actually understand how early intervention has shaped the identity and maybe the confidence of students who have hard of hearing. Your context, Lidia, please.
Thank you, Duncan. Actually, I would like to start in the same way as everybody else, which is the early intervention. So most of the European countries have a newborn screening for hearing and deafness, which is a good thing. However, I believe also, and this is also the belief of the World Health Organization and the specific World Hearing Forum, which I am part of and our organization is part of, is that there should be also school screening. Because in my case, I was born hearing, so obviously, even if there was a newborn screening, everything is fine. But it was the age of 12, a teenager, 11, 12, when I started to lose my hearing. And my parents didn't realize it until the teachers actually picked up that I was not responding in the same way as my friends. And it's simply because I was fooling everyone. I have been such an avid lip reader that nobody has realized that I was actually losing my hearing. It's quite a long, funny story to talk about that, but I don't want to take it away. However, during that time, when I have lost my hearing partially, there was suggestion from medical professionals that my mom should move me to a school for the deaf children. And someone who was an educator in the Polish Association of the Deaf at the time, and who worked with children like me, you know, deaf and hard of hearing, she spent some time with me, just talking with me for half an hour, and she basically made a decision and pushed my mom as well in a way of not going into the deaf or hard of hearing school, but to keep me in the mainstream school. And that was 1970s, which in some ways I'm thinking, you know, we're going backwards even in Europe when it comes to education, because the words she said to my mom was, school has to adapt to her. Basically. And, you know, this is the basics in the end of the day. And luckily, in the school where I was going to, my headmistress, and the teachers were very adaptable, and they managed to work with me to make sure to support me. And the biggest thing for me was I wasn't removed from my environment. Into a new environment, into the completely different school, traveling long way somewhere. I was with my friends, they all knew me, and they were all supporting me in, be it play, but be it also in the classroom. So that support, that emotional support was hugely important. And of course, being in the mainstream school, the expectations were just about same as with everybody else. Well, I couldn't really pass music lessons, for example, very well, but that was just looked upon like, this is the exception. You don't have to worry about it, or you don't have to listen to dictated words and, you know, to actually pass the exams or things like that. So there were small modifications, but by doing that, actually school made sure that I could stay and continue in the mainstream education. And I am so grateful to this lady who made that decision and told my mom that I will be fine. And
Thank
just
you.
to add, you know, the early interventions such as hearing screening are so easily to be implemented in schools, because I would otherwise slip through the fingers if you think about it. Because, you know, you have to test children and also educate children and parents about the safe listening, making sure that we listen with care and don't lose the hearing later on during the school life. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. I think you have brought a spotlight on emphasizing the role parents as first teachers and the importance of home-based reinforcement. Maybe I'll take the discussion back to Sophia. Sophia, you run a Lions Club initiative that trains teachers to identify early signs of vision challenges. In your assessment, remember that we are almost we're almost 5 years to the attainment of Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 4 on education is heavily pegged on inclusive education. How does your initiative at Lions Club contribute to this timely intervention?
If I get your question properly, I think in response to that, I would say that once we identify any eye problems from the schools, because of course Kenya is a struggling country in terms of the economy, and as Faith indicated earlier, that there are genuine cases of people who their priority is not even that side. Their priority could be food, their priority could be maybe getting that school fees. So we bring them to the hospital, of course, partnering with people who are like-minded. And this treatment becomes totally free of charge. Not totally, because we just ask them to pay 100 shillings, because sometimes when you give free things, 100 shillings, Kenyan shillings, is about less $1 or less than $1. So that there's at least commitment from the side of the caregiver. And we make sure that we take them through the treatment journey, through the rehabilitation process in case we reach there, and give them all the support that they require. And one thing I didn't mention is that at Lions, we also run other related clinics, like the Diabetes Care Center, where some of the eye issues are as a result of diabetes. And we also run a ENT program. So both ways, we support these kids across the continuum, all the way to making sure that they are stable enough. The other thing we do that I didn't mention earlier is that we also work with organizations who have other disabilities apart from the sensory disabilities. For example, the Special Olympics, where we have most of these kids who are autistic. And for the autistic kids, you find that, I don't know, but a research was done, and they have above 40% of them will have issues to do with their eyesight. And some of these eyesight issues will include refractive problems, strabismus, I'm sure you must have come across these kids, and they will always have an issue with sight. So that is basically what we do in the hospital.
Well, Faith, since you're one of the stakeholders, being in the digital era, maybe you can spell out a few programs that you're working to make sure that even in the transition of digital space, what do we have that can also support the early intervention space for children with sensory disabilities?
Thank you, Duncan. I think continuing with what Sophia is talking and what Lydia has been talking about, and also Jeremy, one of the things that we do not have are resources and information outside there for either trainers, professionals, healthcare providers, on just getting to understand disability itself, or not only sensory disability, but any type of disability. So at Sense International, we do have a global resource hub that was recently launched, and whereby we are collecting resources from different parts of the country. It's like a hub whereby every other individual is able to get this information when it comes to the resources that we do have, not only for the deafblind. When we talk about even disabilities, in most cases, the deafblind community is still left behind in the conversations of disability itself. It's just only recently that deafblindness was recognized by the UN. So this is the first time we're celebrating the first International Deafblindness Awareness Day. So you see, in as much as when we look at the numbers, it looks like it's a small category, but then we're looking at the expenses that it goes on to the families to take care of a child with deaf blindness or multisensory impairments. It's really, really challenging, and it's for them. But then on conversations to looking at early interventions and making sure that this is really important, we need to make sure that we do have appropriate professionals that are trained to care for children with multisensory impairments. Currently, you look at occupational therapists, teachers that have been trained. They've been trained on maybe a specific disability. I've been trained in sign language, but I'm not trained to work with a child who is hard of hearing and low vision. That categorically is deaf blindness, but then the support and intervention that is needed is totally different. So looking at a continuum of early intervention and inclusive education, even to the aspect of employability, because then again, if the support is not there from the beginning, that will not get to the employability itself. So why Sense International takes a lifelong approach itself, a life cycle of an individual, and making sure that through the every entries of an individual, we are able to give you the support system that is needed. But then again, we're not saying we're doing it perfectly, because again, resource allocation, we are an INGO, so we depend on funding. So what we look at is working with stakeholders like government and other partners. That's why we work within public hospital, public schools, to create a scale-up model whereby the government can be able to emulate the pilots of that we've been able to do and see that it's workable, and then now replicate it in other counties. Lidia, you talked about in Europe having neonatal screening. In Kenya, it's not happening. It only happens in private hospitals. And when you are aware, how many parents that do we have that have high literacy level or are aware that there's this type of screening? It's mostly in the urban centers. Yeah.
Okay, maybe Jeremy, since you're an advocate for the deaf and blind, maybe are you experiencing the same challenges at resource level?
Well, I wouldn't call myself an advocate for deaf blindness. I'm a pan-disability advocate. I believe very strongly in...
Sorry for that.
That's fine. That's fine. I happen to know several deaf-blind people, and in fact, last year we had the well-known Haben Gimmer actually as our keynote address. So, people in the previous conference last year got a wonderful exposure to the extraordinary, the extraordinary ability and potential of deaf-blindness. Deaf-blindness is as you've just said, Faith, interestingly, is a relatively new, recognized issue. Now, it's always been around, but it's been relatively recently that it's been accepted and understood. And I think this is indicative of classic medical model history that we've been coming out of, is that if anybody was going to be hidden, it was going to be a deaf-blind person. So that's a reality. But what did you have another question for me, Duncan? Just so that I can be clear.
We were just comparing whether the challenge of resources also applied to the visually impaired.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I was saying earlier about schools. So our schools, our 22 blind schools, have a significant resource problem. There are a couple that are good, and there are several that are very poor, and there are some of them middle of the road. But here's an interesting thing. Not one of them offer higher grade mathematics. Most of them offer what's called maths literacy. In fact, most of them don't offer any maths at all at a grade 12 level. And some of them are able to do what's called maths literacy. No science, what we used to call science. I think science has changed its lame name now, but what we used to call science at schools. No, that isn't taught. Now, what that is, that's an indicative issue around the teacher. That's a resource, and it's a resource from a money point of view, but it's also a resource in the sense of a skill. So we have a problem with every single one of our schools for disability, is that we are providing them with the substandard education. So what's happening is we're seeing more and more kids going over to mainstream school. Like Lidia, I also went to a mainstream school in the 70s, in a very similar situation where my older brother was at a school for the blind before me, and I persuaded my parents that I did not want to go to a school for the blind. I wanted to go to a mainstream school. And I believe I'm not suggesting that we can't have mainstream schools, but I am suggesting that we need to look more at inclusion in mainstream schools. And so children with ambitious parents, perhaps, who are not happy with the idea of their child getting a substandard education, are exploring homeschooling or mainstream schooling, which I think is a good thing. I really do. I think it's an excellent way. Unfortunately, that opens up another Pandora's box of challenges, but we can talk about that just now.
Well, we will have requested for an extension of time, but as we're coming to an end, I think I'll loop in Lidia. From the panelists, you could realize we are all from the global south. And there's one thing that is very common, resource gap. Maybe considering Europe has made milestone, how can we bridge this gap in access to support, timely intervention for all the learners as we wrap up?
Oh, thank you, Duncan. Yes, I'm realizing, listening to everyone, just thinking how lucky we are in Europe with regard to children, especially, not to adults. Adults, we still have a lot of work to do to support them in interventions such as hearing aids or cochlear implant, but especially hearing aids. But yes, something I neglected to mention as part of my intervention was actually a hearing aid. At the time, because I'm Polish, I was born in Poland and lived for half of my life there. It was difficult to get hearing aids, but it was Polish Association of the Deaf who was helping me and my parents to get access to hearing aids, so I could continue in mainstream school easily. And that is the first intervention. Access to hearing aids or cochlear implants or assistive listening devices, whatever this child needs, are a main thing, basically, to allow them to continue. But it's further than that. It's also that not all schools, not always 100% so good. Nordic countries are usually very good. United Kingdom is good as well. Poland is, doing so much better, where there are all the different interventions, including hearing loops, paying installs in classrooms, and all those different things going on. But right now, also the fact that there is subtitling or captioning. In UK, we say, in Europe, we say subtitling. In generally, in globally, we talk about captioning. So whatever educational materials are, in existence in the schools, as long as the child can follow the captioning, they follow the dialogue, they can be together with their peers and they are able to work together. But there is also something like tactics, different communications tactics being deployed by the teachers to ensure that they are smaller group, to make sure that children can actually follow group discussions and follow the actual, work. So instead of following just speaking and hearing to make sure that child's here, sometimes very simple interventions can go a really long way.
Thank you so much, panelists. I'll invite Sonia. We think she has one quick question. Sonia?
Yes, thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful discussion. You truly have helped us understand a lot of the different aspects of sensorial disabilities, both from your experiences, your interventions, and most importantly, your work. So thank you so much and keep up the good work. Now, I have two questions, I believe, very interesting questions for your panel. One of them being, are children who are hard of hearing misdiagnosed as having neurodivergent disabilities? So basically, someone is asking us that, are we misdiagnosing children either way? Either they have a hearing disability and we assume that this is neurodivergent case. Anybody who wants to answer that question? Yes, Miss Lydia.
Actually, this is a very good question. You know what? It's not just children. Also, older people are being misdiagnosed with dementia, when in fact, all you need to do is check the hearing first before you go anywhere further. So it's such a basic thing. And you know what? The World Health Organization, it has even developed a very simple app which anybody can use and anybody can test if somebody has the hearing loss. So the first thing, always, always, always check the hearing. It's so simple.
Okay, thank you for that. So there we are. For those of us
I would
who-
like, can I just chip in there? Because I'd like to add that it is so true. I mean, I've heard of it so often where children with deafness are assumed to have had some form of intellectual disability, learning disability, neurodiversity, call it what you want. And the misdiagnosis is so common. I've lost count of the number of times that I've heard of that when people tell their stories later. It's a very, very common thing.
True, true. So thank you for that. The second question is an interesting question because, as I said when we were having a discussion earlier on, this is the only panel where we managed to get, as he calls himself, Mr. Phil, on board as the international sign language interpreter. And there was a huge debate amongst our experts and advisors where we had one side divided and saying we don't need an international sign language interpreter or any sign language interpreter for our events. And we had the other divide that said, even if we have one attendee that requires this service, we will provide it at whatever cost. So help us to understand, how do we, especially now that we're at a global level with this summit, how do we conquer this challenge? Because we wouldn't want to be in that situation again for sure. So who can help us? Yes, Faith, and then we'll come back to Miss Lydia. Thank you.
Okay, it's a really interesting conversation that we are having. And one thing that I remember discussing is we can't talk about inclusion as a people and not really provide it. Because then why are you preaching water and drinking wine, or vice versa? So I think for us to preach inclusion and really show it, we need to embrace it as organization, as advocates, as people working within the sector, making sure that in every activity or forums that we are having, it's really important to provide these. The sign language interpreter, one of the reasons that most